حضرته जिब्रील अमी पैगाम खुदा लेकर आए थे शब असरा अल्लाह ने अर्श पे बुलवाया कुर्बत का शरफ उनको बख्शा अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह फमुहम्मदुना हुवा सय्यिदुना فالعز لنا لإجابته सो मुहम्मद है अपने आका इसी नाम से अपनी इज़्ज़ो बक़ा अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह الصبح بدا من طلعته والليل دجا من وفرته है नूरे सहर चेहरे से तेरे और शब की रौनक जुल्फों से अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह अल्लाहु 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 अल्लाह जज़ाकल्लाह खैर।
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الأمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. Dear respected brothers and elders, mothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah Azza wa Jalla for gathering us here in the masjid from the masajid of Allah Azza wa Jalla. As Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentions, أَحَبُّ الْبِلَادِ إِلَى اللَّهِ مَسَاجِدُهَا, the most beloved of lands to Allah Azza wa Jalla are the masajid. In another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentions, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ مَنْ طَالَ عُمْرُهُ وَحَسْنَ عَمَلُهُ, the best of people are those whom Allah Azza wa Jalla has granted a long life and has blessed them with righteous actions. So the longer we are able to do righteous actions, the better it is for us. So alhamdulillah, Allah Azza wa Jalla has granted us the opportunity to gather here in this masjid. As it comes to no surprise, as has been mentioned, today's discussion is on Salahuddin Al-Ayubbi, rahimahullah ta'ala. Just as a raise of hands, how many of you have heard of him before? Okay, a good portion of the masjid, mashallah ta'ala. Before we begin anything, we need to know our purpose, vision, goal, and intention when we do anything. Before we embark on a journey, we need to know why we are embarking on that journey. As Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentions, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are judged by their intentions. So the purpose of you and I sitting here today is two-pronged. We have two reasons. Okay, two reasons. The first intention we want to keep is that this is an academic, darsi lesson, a historical lesson. That you and I today, inshallah ta'ala, are going to learn about a specific portion of Muslim history. About 80 to 100 years, in the 1200s, we are going to discuss about a certain portion of Muslim history. We're not talking about the entire Muslim tradition. We're not talking about the entire Muslim world. We're going to be talking about a specific portion of Muslim history. That is to learn our history. If we do not know our history, we cannot value our history. Islam has a deep intellectual tradition. We have a long military history, political power. And we need to be aware of this history so that we can appreciate it and so that we can learn from their mistakes and learn from their shortcomings, as well as learn how they were able to establish an Islamic civilization. So that's the first step. The second step, the second part of our intention, is that we look at the stories of the lives of the people of the past and gain some sort of understanding. Allah Azza wa says in the Quran, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Within the stories of the people of the past, there is a lesson for those who have understanding, for those who have intellect. So we're going to look at the people's lives in the past and come to some sort of conclusion, come to an understanding and say, hey, they went through difficulties. They went through struggles as well. So how are you and I going to deal with some struggles that they also might have went through? Inshallah, we all make this intention while sitting here? Inshallah. With that said, let's get started. They're still working on the slides. Okay, perfect. MashaAllah, just in time. Okay, perfect. MashaAllah ta'ala. So let us begin. Prior to talking about Salahuddin and the Crusaders, we need to go back a little bit. We need to go to the 1000s. Show of hands, how many of you have heard about the Seljuk Empire? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, mashallah. There's more than some other communities, mashallah. It seems to be a very well-read, educated community, mashallah. The Seljuk Empire are a very important empire that we need to be aware of. Who are they? They are nomadic Turks. They grew up in an area that we have over here known as Ma Wara'un Nahar, the area behind the Oxus River. I'm just going to hold this, it's easier for me. Ma Wara'un Nahar, the area behind the Oxus River. This is modern day Uzbekistan, modern day Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, all those stand countries other than Pakistan and Afghanistan, other than those two, all the other stand countries. This area is the Central Asian steppes. Okay? The Central Asian steppes. This is where the Turkish people and the Turkic people originate from. If you see over here, can you see the pointer? Yes. What is this country in modern day countries? Anyone know? Yes? Turkey, mashallah. This is Turkey. Turkey and the Turkish people are not from Turkey originally. They're from over here, from Central Asia. The Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, those countries, they're from right over there. This is where they're from. How did they end up over here? That's what we're going to discuss in a minute, inshallah. So the Seljuk Empire are a group of nomads, or the group of Turkic nomads. They crossed this river right over here. This is known as the Oxus River, also known as Amu Darya in Arabic. They accept Islam and they cross the river and they come to these established civilizations, Muslim civilizations, and they end up taking over these lands and they become the rulers of these lands. Again, These Turkic nomads accept Islam and they cross over this river and they end up ruling eventually through ruling over these Muslim lands. And these people are known as the Seljuk Empire. These Seljuks, again, are nomads. They used to be nomads. They live in these tents. These tents are known as yurts in their language. If you see the background, when I say Central Asian steppes are hilly grasslands. You can't grow crops and plantations over there. You can't have fruits and trees. So they're not an agriculture community. They used to have horses, as you can see in the back. They used to have cattle, sheep, whatever they had. They'd move to a location, set up their tents, and when they ran out of resources, they would get up, pack their bags, and move on to a next locality. This is what they used to do. So these nomadic individuals move into the Muslim lands, and they are known as the Seljuk Empire. The peak of power was during the rule of Alp Arsalan and Malik Shah. These two individuals, we want to remember the name. Alp Arsalan and Malik Shah. Both of these individuals were Turkic people. However, they had an important right-hand man. His name was Nizamul Mulk. Nizamul Mulk, rahimahullah ta'ala. Show of hands. Anyone have heard of him before? Okay. 2 people, mashallah. Nizamul Mulk was the Grand Vizier or the right-hand man of the Sultan, both for Alp Arsalan and Malik Shah. Nizamul Mulk is very important. First of all, he's Persian. He's not Turkish. He's used to civilization. He grew up in a civilized society. He knows how to run a government. Persian people, it's in their blood to run governments. Like, for example, Desi people, we are very good at computer science and IT. It's in our blood, right? Likewise, it's in the Persians' blood to run a government. They knew how to do bureaucracy and running a government. So they had these individuals running, the Nizam al-Mulk would run and help establish the government, because Turkish people, or the Turkic people at that time, they're nomads, right? Just a generation before, they used to live in these grasslands. They don't really know how to run a government. So with the help of Nizam al-Mulk, they're able to establish a proper government, a functioning, sort of centralized government. But more important than that is Nizam al-Mulk does something for the first time. And this is establish the Nizamiya Madrasa system, or in other words, state-sponsored education, wherein students of knowledge would learn all the Islamic sciences of Arabic, Hadith, Tafsir, Aqidah, Fiqh, and etc., while at the same time studying astronomy, geometry, mathematics, medicine as well. So this is very, very important. And the star student of this system is none other than Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Anyways, Alp Arsalan. Alp Arsalan does something very important. He takes his army and he goes out to battle against the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, before the battle, they ruled over most of this land right over here, right? Most of this land, not everything, but most of modern-day Turkey was ruled by the Byzantines. Alp Arsalan takes his army of Muslims and he goes to fight the Byzantines in a monumental and very, very important battle known as the Battle of Manzikert. Can we all say that name? Manzikert in 1071. Okay, we need to remember these dates. 1071 is known as the Battle of Manzikert. And Alp Arsalan and the Muslims are able to take a decisive victory against the Byzantines. A very important battle. So much so that the emperor of the Byzantines is taken as a prisoner into the tent of Alp Arsalan. Alp Arsalan, possibly out of the kindness of his heart, or more than likely as a political maneuver, he lets him go. And he says, you can go back to your country. Go back to your capital. What's the capital of the Byzantines? Yes? Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, right? Constantinople is the capital of the Byzantines. So he goes back, and what do you think if the leader of a country comes back with his army wiped out? Civil war. That's what happens inside Constantinople. Why are we mentioning all this? It's going to come, inshallah. Few things in history can we say event A happened, therefore event B happened. But with the Battle of Manzikert, it directly leads to the Crusades. And that's what we're going to talk about, inshallah. So after the Battle of Manzikert, These Turkic nomads that are used to this grassland lifestyle, they're not used to civilization. So when these Muslim Turkic people tried moving to the cities, it resulted in a big problem. The civilized Muslims did not really get along with these nomadic, sort of barbarian type of people. They just accepted Islam, they have their own traditions, they're not used to civilized life. There's no such thing as personal property. It's just grasslands. You send your sheep wherever you want. So they come into the cities and they send their sheep to all, personal private property, which becomes a huge issue. So Alp Arslan took them out to battle and he says, hey, see all that area west? It's all yours now. So all these, not all of them, but many of these Turkic families and nomads and tribes eventually move west. Okay? And they settle in these lands known as Anatolia. Eventually, the Ottomans, right, who are the Ottoman Empire from Osman, he is also a descendant of some of these early tribes that migrated after the Battle of Manzikert, right? And that's a story for another day. So the Battle of Manzikert is very important because all these Turkic nomads now start migrating west. And this is how Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, is populated with the Turkish people. These Turkic individuals now intermingle and intermarry with the local Greek population. And this is why Turkish people in general look very much different than the people of the other Stan countries, right? Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, they still look a little Asian. But the Turkish people don't necessarily look that much Asian, more European. And that's because they intermingled and married with the Greek population. And of course, many of them accepted Islam as well. And this is how the Turkish people, or the Turkic people, ended up in modern-day Turkey. Now, if you have a bunch of Turkic Muslims taking over your land, literally in a span of a couple of weeks, overnight, the Byzantines lost thousands, right? Thousands of miles of acres of land. It's going to cause concern for the emperor. So the emperor, he requests help from the Catholic Pope Urban II. Now, can someone tell me why this is crazy? And this is not something that you would think would happen. Mustafa, you were there in the other session. You can't answer. Come on. Anyone else? Yes, there are different Christian factions, 2 different denominations. The Byzantines are Orthodox Christians, while the other Roman Empire is the Catholics. And they hate each other. They consider each other kuffar. If they were to see each other in battle, they'd kill each other. They don't even consider each other to be Christian. So now the emperor has to literally go beg. The Orthodox emperor has to now go beg the Catholic Pope. Hey, listen, at the end of the day, we all believe in Jesus. These Muslims are at our front door, right? I can see them from Constantinople. We need help. Now this Catholic Pope, it's not out of the kindness of my heart, I'm going to help my Christian brethren and help them fight against the Muslims. No, he does not care. He wouldn't care at all, right? He doesn't care at all. But why does he do this? 2 main reasons. First of all, you have to understand that the system in Europe, they call it quote-unquote the Dark Ages, it's a feudal system. You have a bunch of people who are slaves to the land in Europe. And they toil, they work very hard, and whatever produce that they gather, they have to give to their masters and the lords of the land. And they get barely any sustenance for themselves. So if you have a community like that, you don't have time for education. You don't have time to learn and get yourself educated, because all day you're working on the farm, and then you're given barely any resources to survive, right? So the slaves to the land. So Pope Urban II, he says, listen, you go out and fight in the path of God against these Muslims, and I will grant you freedom, right? You'll be free. And also, there's a lot of tension that's being built up. Europe, prior to the Christians, followed what religion? Sorry? Pagans. They're all pagans. They're polytheists. Christianity comes in, and much of Europe becomes Christian, either due to voluntary conversion and sometimes forced conversion, right? So most of Europe is now Christian. Now, these lords who are ruling over lands, they want more land, right? So they have to fight other land lords. But all the other lords are Christian. Now, the Pope cannot substantiate that. The Pope can't say, hey, it's okay, go fight your Christian Catholic brother. He can't say that. And he knows these people want more land. Where do they send them? Send them to the Muslim lands. Send them to the Middle East. Send them to Syria. For these 2 factors and a couple other political and economic factors, this is what you call the pan-European crusades, where they give a big bayan and tashkil and targhib to, hey, go out and fight the Muslims. And this is the beginning of the crusades. Now, let's flip angles right now. After Alp Arslan, Malik Shah takes over. Malik Shah passes away, Nizam al-Mulk passes away. After these two individuals pass away, the Seljuk Empire kind of crumbles. It becomes very much decentralized. You have a lot of princes and sons and cousins of the Seljuks, all these Seljuk princes fighting and vying for power. They take different cities, they rule over it, they're not unified, they all believe that they're the hot shot and they try to rule over, they fight each other. And now the Muslim Ummah in that sense, in that area, is very much disunited. And whenever the Muslim Ummah is disunited like that, the outside enemy comes in. Now this is also a very important factor to understand, very important principle, that the political leaders of the Muslims played politics. They are not our religious leaders. The Muslims of the past understood this, that the Muslims, the general public like you and I, they did not go to the political leader. They didn't expect him to be the epitome of taqwa, that he is going to adopt all of righteousness. They didn't expect that. They went to the ulama for that. They went to the mashayikh for the spiritual guidance. Right? So the political leader, for the most part, played politics. Right? He was a politician. So they didn't necessarily always be united as Muslims, and much of the Muslim lands were not ever, after 750, right? This is a story for another day, but after 750 Common Era, 132 Hijri, the Muslims were never ever united under one individual. Okay? Never. The entire Muslim lands were never united in one individual. This is a misconception, this is a myth, that up to 100 years ago, we were all united together and all our problems would be solved if we're united. Yes, it's important to be united, but it's not the only issue, right? In the Muslim Ummah, we had different areas. In the pre-modern world, it's not so easy to be centralized. You're in different parts, right? If somebody rebels, like let's say you're in Iraq, and somebody rebels in North Africa, you won't find out for another month. And then it's going to take you another month to send that. By that time, he's already established his dynasty. What are you going to do about it? So that's how it is, right? You had different areas. In India, you had your own system. You had in Middle East, you had some people ruling. In North Africa, Andalus, you had different people ruling. So this idea that everyone was always unified till 100 years ago is a wrong idea, and it's romanticizing history. Likewise, you think all the politicians and all the Muslim leaders always got along each other is also romanticizing history and painting a false image, right? Studying history has to be as accurate as possible. So these individuals, Seljuk princes, they fought each other. They were fighting each other. So when the Crusaders came in, they were not ready for it. Rather, when the Crusaders would attack one Muslim city, the other governor of another Muslim city would sit back and watch, and he would hope that the Crusaders would do some damage, and then he would sweep in to take the rest. This was what happened. This was what was going on at that time. Very disgusting, but this was what was going on. So the first Crusades happened. There's details to it, but at the end of it, 4 different cities or city-states, small kingdoms if you want to say, are established. These are previous Muslim lands, but they are now taken at the hands of the Crusaders and now are Christian lands. And that is, you have 4 lands. Let me pull up the map. You have Edessa. Oh, that's the wrong one. You have Edessa, which is in modern-day Turkey. You have Antioch, which is also in modern-day Turkey. And then you have Tripoli, which is in modern-day Lebanon and Syria. This is not the Tripoli of Libya, which is all the way over there. And then you also, of course, you have Jerusalem, all the way down over here. Jerusalem is taken in 1099. What year was Manzikert? 1071. In a period of 30 years, look what happens. The Crusaders are able to take all this. So Battle of Manzikert leads to the nomadic tribes moving west. This leads to a cause of concern for the emperor. The emperor asks hope from his Catholic enemies, leads to the Crusades. You can see this chain reaction very clearly. So these 4 cities are taken. Of course, it's no surprise to what happens in Jerusalem. These Christian Crusaders, these barbarian type individuals walk into the city, kill every single Muslim that's there. They boast with much pride that the blood of the Muslims is reaching to their knees, right? And not only that, they came in, they killed the Jews, and this is a normal thing. They would always kill Jews. Actually, when the first Crusaders, they were coming, on the way they stopped by a Jewish village and just massacred the entire village, right? The Europeans were always prosecuting the Jews, and the Muslims were the ones who would help them out more often. And not only that, these Christians came in, these Catholic Christians, and they massacred every other denomination of Christians as well. Anyone that wasn't Catholic was also massacred. So this is something that's accepted, in fact, in history. You can even ask Christians that these crusaders were disgusting people. These crusaders were evil, the scum of the earth, barbarian type of individuals, uneducated, bloodthirsty individuals, and because they would kill their own denominations of Christianity. Now, these people who passed away in Jerusalem, this is pain that we feel, right? This existence of pain, we have to feel it. We don't undermine that pain. But at the same time, we have to look at it in a higher lens. That these people, they're shuhada, they're martyrs. And Allah says about the shuhada, that they're not dead, they're alive in their graves, right? So this pain we feel, but this should not lead to other issues. These same individuals, if you were to ask them, would you do that again? They would die again. If you look at the people of Al-Aqsa today, what happened in Ramadan? They knew they were going to be shot. They knew they were going to be hurt. They knew they might even die. But they drove hours away to go pray in Al-Aqsa. These people of Al-Aqsa have such strong iman. They would never give it up. May Allah grant us such iman and yaqeen. So, like I mentioned, disunity amongst the Turkic leaders led to the small Crusader army to continue to conquer. They weren't like a huge army. They were a significant army, but they were considerably small compared to the Muslim forces. But because of the disunity, this is what happened. In the background, you see one of the Crusader fortresses, which I believe is in Tripoli. As you can see, the fortresses were built on hills, as that's much easier to defend. You can see the enemy coming, and if you're to attack or siege the fortress, you have to have uphill climb. If any of you have went uphill, you know how difficult that is, right? Already it's hard enough to climb, now you have to fight and defend. It's a very strategic maneuver to place a fortress on top of a hill. And this area is still there today. Another misconception that I want to mention is that for another 80 years, we don't conquer Jerusalem. However, it's not as if, the Muslims of these different cities, eventually Muslims do move into some of these cities and they live there. It's not as if they're constantly persecuted and constantly being oppressed. That was not the case, actually. The Christians that moved in, Islam is a type of religion and culture that when people kind of see it, they kind of start adopting it, whether they like it or not. They start absorbing it. So many of these Christians become Arab, quote-unquote Arab, right? Or quote-unquote, they don't accept Islam, but they very much adopt the Muslim culture. So they mentioned themselves that we had a very good relationship with the Muslims that were living there. But these new crusaders that keep coming, you have these new barbarians that have on religious fervor, religious desire, they keep coming out. They say themselves that these ones are ruining our relationship with the Muslims. So Muslims in the city, they were not so much being oppressed, but the Muslims in the villages and outside in the farmlands, yes, definitely, whenever a Crusader army would come, they would definitely do all these evil atrocities. But the ones that were living in these cities themselves, they were not necessarily always oppressing the Muslims. So that's something to keep in mind. For the next 30 years, the Muslims are not able to, remember 1099 is when Jerusalem is taken. For the next 30 years, the Muslims are not able to land any significant blow against these Crusader Christians who have taken these lands. Until Allah Azza wa Jalla sends an individual by the name of Imaduddin al-Zangi. Moving on forward, we are going to have a lot of names. So we should try to keep it in memory as much as possible, inshallah ta'ala. So he's appointed as the Emir of a city. Emir just means the leading ruler, whatever you want to call it, president of Mosul. Okay? Mosul is a city in modern day Iraq. When he comes into power, there is a shift of the balance of power in the Syrian area, right? If I have the map, let me just so you see now with Imaduddin al-Zangi, what you see, what's happening is the beginning of a united Syrian front. Imaduddin al-Zangi wants to unite the Muslims first. Because to fight the Crusaders, you need to be able to be united. If you have a bunch of different enemies around you, a bunch of different Muslims, when you attack the Crusaders, another Muslim army might fight you. So this is the beginning of a unified Syrian empire. This is Syria right over here, okay? And this is where all the action's taking place, right? The Crusaders is really much a very specific portion of Muslim history and a very specific portion of the current Muslim empire. The current Muslim empire is like all the way from here and extending all the way over here, right? And even more west. So this is a very small portion, right? So right over here, Imaduddin al-Zangi begins his Syrian dynasty. And he's very stern, very strict. And this makes his army very much loyal to him. He has a famous statement wherein he states, there cannot be two zalims, two oppressors in one city. He is saying that I am a zalim, I will oppress, but I will not let any of you oppress. So if you commit any wrong against anyone of any ethnic, cultural, religious background, you will feel the pain for that. And this is why the army respected him. And many people started joining his army because they saw that he had a focus on jihad and he was a little different from everyone else. He was built a little different. His most important feat was the reconquest of Edessa. Right? Edessa was one of the first cities that was taken. Edessa is very important in terms of strategy and economic importance. It's all the way to the north, as we saw on the map earlier. If it's on the north, if you take over Edessa, now you have blocked the Crusaders coming in from the north. It's also strategic importance because it's in the middle of trade routes. So you have a lot of economic gain from that as well. So he takes over Edessa. How he exactly does that, I'm going to pass over that. But Edessa, after 28 days, he reconquers Edessa. And this is very significant. Imaduddin al-Zengi, rahimahullah, passes away. His son Nuruddin al-Zengi takes over. Now the reconquest of Edessa sent shock waves across the European lands. They're very much worried. So they send the Second Crusades. Because of that, they send a new batch of crusaders to attack Damascus. I'll come back to these other points in a bit. So they attacked Damascus. Was Damascus one of the 4 cities that was conquered by the Crusaders? No, it was not. It was not conquered. Damascus is an ancient city, right? It was not conquered. But it was ruled by another Muslim governor. Unlike the people of the past, Nuruddin didn't watch them get defeated. Nuruddin went to help them. Nuruddin comes to the rescue. The Crusaders retreat. The Second Crusades were pretty much a failure. The people of Damascus, seeing Nuruddin and hearing about his qualities, they overthrow their own governor and say, we don't want you anymore. And they hand the city over to Nuruddin and say, we want you to rule over us. So slowly you see this united Syrian front. You have much of Iraq is now, much of East Syria is now conquered by Zengi. Some portion of Iraq is ruled by Zengi. Now he gets Damascus as well. Zengi himself was a very efficient ruler. He was more pious than his father. One of the first things he would do was establish madaris, educational systems. Once you establish madaris, the ulama and the students of knowledge love you. At the same time, he was establishing welfare systems, social services, taking care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the weak people of the community, so the general public loves you. So people from different parts of the area would now leave their cities and join Zengi's city and Zengi's army. So Nuruddin al-Zengi, actually his wife, there's a famous story, his wife wakes up one day in a very sour, angry mood. Zengi's like, okay, why are you so upset? Why are you so mad? His wife says, I missed my tahajjud salah tonight. Again, she said, I missed my tahajjud salah, so she was in a bad mood. She had such guilt that she missed her tahajjud salah. Nuruddin Zengi, hearing this, he appoints an individual, paying him a high sum of money to go around the city in Damascus at tahajjud time, banging on some instrument or a drum or something, waking up the people for tahajjud. Because of this, the entire city of Damascus was praying tahajjud. The remorse and guilt and this feeling of missing over a nafil act by one woman made the entire city pray tahajjud. Right? This is the guilt, subhanAllah, if you think about this, crazy. And these are the type of people that Allah Azza wa Jalla sent Nuruddin to. These are the type of people Allah Azza wa Jalla sent Salahuddin to. These are the type of people that Allah Azza wa Jalla sent great leaders to. It's not as if we just sit here and a great leader is going to come. We have to change first. We have to be the people who can stand in his army. We have to be the people. Salahuddin had this thing that his people, when he would go on battles, he would read hadith or have the ulama read hadith through the sufuf, through the lines of the army. He'd make sure everyone was up for tahajjud. He'd make sure everyone was praying Salatul Fajr and Jama'ah. These were the type of people that reconquered Jerusalem. It's not as if there was a bunch of individuals sitting there and then Salahuddin came. No, these people changed and Allah sent change. So there's something important to keep in mind. So Nuruddin, he rules for a while. In the meantime, let's backtrack a little bit. Imaduddin, who was the father of Nuruddin, he once was running away from battle. He lost a very bad battle and he's running away. The army is chasing him. He goes to a city known as Tikrit and he asks the ruler, hey, grant me refuge. Let me get in your fortress and save me from this incoming army. The leader says yes. And the leader is none other than Najmuddin, the father of who? Salahuddin. Okay? Imaduddin does not forget this favor. Few years later, in the same city Tikrit, which is ruled by Najmuddin and his brother Shirkuh, These two individuals are forced to leave their city due to something that happened. They're forced to leave their city. And they're leaving in the night. They're exiled from their own city. On that night, Salahuddin Al-Ayubbi rahimahullah ta'ala is born. Najmuddin is very pessimistic about his child. He's like, my child was born today, on this day. What a bad day to have a child. In Islam, we don't believe in bad omens, but whatever. Everyone has their weaknesses. So he started to have these wasawis, evil thoughts about, doing something like forgetting the child, abandoning the child, stuff like that, right? Not proper thoughts, wasawis of shaitan. His servant who was there with him, he tells his master, Najmuddin, why are you saying such things? Perhaps Allah Azza wa Jalla will unite the Muslims to this man. Perhaps Allah Azza wa Jalla will bring back Al-Aqsa to this man, to this child. And perhaps, I say, that it was a dua of this sincere servant that Allah accepted it from him. So we should never ever undervalue nasiha or advice. الدين النصيحة أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. The Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, the deen itself is well-wishing. So when we see somebody entering the masjid we haven't seen before, we be there for them. We give good advice to the younger ones, to the people that we can help out, to the people who respect us, the people who don't respect us. Never undervalue giving good advice. With hikmah, with wisdom. But one advice can change the life of a person. One advice can change the life of a person. And we see this with Najmuddin and his servant. We don't know the servant's name, but the reward of Salahuddin's feats are going through this servant. So we don't know, right? We don't need our name to become famous. We just need to be there to say things at the right time, at the right place. So anyways, these individuals, Shirkuh and Najmuddin, they have nowhere to go. So they go to Imaduddin. Okay, hey, Imaduddin, help us out. Imaduddin, he doesn't forget the favor from a few years back. He welcomes them warmly, calls them into a city, and makes them military commanders of his army. Because Najmuddin and Shirkuh are excellent military commanders. And this continues, and they continue to serve Nuruddin. Okay, Najmuddin and Shirkuh, the father and uncle of Salahuddin, they serve Nuruddin, the son of Imaduddin. A lot of names, but let's try to keep up, inshallah. So Salahuddin grows up under the guidance of these three individuals. His father, Najmuddin, his uncle, Shirkuh, and the governor or the ruler of the Zengid dynasty, Nuruddin al-Zengi. He learns military prowess, strategy, how to hold the sword, how to fight with the bow and arrow, and all these different things he learns from these three individuals. However, much of his youth was spent with the time of the ulama. He studied Quran, he memorized the Quran at a young age, he studied fiqh and hadith, and he studied aqidah and these different subjects. And as we will come to see, he had no goal of becoming any political leader or sultan. He spent time with the ulama. He wanted to become an alim. And later on in his life, when he's a sultan, when he would walk by the gatherings of ulama and the majalis and the madaris, he would be in tears because he would want to sit with them. That was his goal, his vision. But Allah Azza wa Jalla has chosen it for something else. It's something very, very important. Sometimes we think we want to do something. This is the path I want to take. This is what I want to do. But Allah Azza wa Jalla has chalked a different path in life for you and I. Right? Many times we want to do something. Due to circumstances, Allah Azza wa Jalla has chosen something else for us. We don't know what's khair for us. And we will see this in Sultan Salahuddin. He had no desire to become a sultan. He wanted to become an alim. But Allah chose him for a different purpose, as we will come to see, inshallah ta'ala. So Salahuddin spends much of his time, youth, in the company of ulama. Now Nuruddin, like I mentioned, he's conquering all these lands. He has much of Syria under his control. The Crusaders are getting weaker. They're still a constant threat, but they're very much weaker than they were before. So they continue to expand. But there is a very big thorn in the side of Islam at this point. Who rules over Egypt right now in the 1100s? Yes, the Fatimids, mashallah. The Fatimids are Shia. They are a heretical Sevener Ismaili Shia group. They believe in a concept of imamah, where their Khalifa, which they call the Imam, is divinely inspired. He gains wahi. He's a descendant of Ali radiallahu anh, and he is kind of there's different variants of it. Some think of he's God's mandate on earth. Some consider him to be God himself. They have different various heretical beliefs. Anyways, at this point in time, the Fatimids are very weak. The Imam, the Khalifa himself is just a puppet. He has no power. The power lies in the Grand Vizier, or the right-hand man of the Khalifa. At this point in time, we have Shawar. Okay? Shawar is the right-hand man of the Khalifa. He has the real power. Long story short, he is somehow taken out of power. He wants to get reinstated. So, he goes to Zengi, Nuruddin Zengi. Like, hey Zengi, help me out. I'll pay for your expenses of your military campaign. I'll give you a third of my produce, of any type of profit we have this year. It's all yours, a third of it. Zengi's hesitant, doesn't really want to do it. He doesn't trust this guy. He looks like a shady guy. But he says yes for various reasons. So he sends Shirkuh, who's Shirkuh? Uncle of Salahuddin. And he sends Salahuddin to go help reinstate Shawar. They reinstate Shawar. He becomes Grand Vizier. Shawar backstabs him, kicks him out of the country, and doesn't pay a penny. Now this happens 2 more times. He comes again, Zengi, help me out. They help him out a second time, he backstabs him. 3rd time he comes like, Zengi, help me out. This time, Nuruddin's like, yeah, sure, we got you. Then he tells Shirkuh and Salahuddin, this time, help him out, put him back in power, then cut off his head and take over Egypt. And they do exactly that. However, this 3rd time, Salahuddin's like, I don't want to go. What am I going to do there? I have nothing to do there. Leave me alone. I'm going to stay here. I don't want to go. Nuruddin, whom Salahuddin respected very much, he says, you will go with your uncle, help him out. When Nuruddin says this, Salahuddin says, Sami'ana wa ta'ana type of thing. He's like, okay, I'll go. But I'll go, I'll do what I need to do, and I'll come back, and I'm done. So this 3rd time, they go, they take care of Shawar, and Shirkuh, the uncle of Salahuddin, is now the Grand Vizier of the Fatimid Khilafat. That is very unique. You have Shirkuh, who's a delegate of a Sunni empire or the dynasty, who's also the most powerful man in the Shi'i Khilafat. Very unique situation, right? It eventually begins to break down, obviously. However, Shirkuh, due to the qadr of Allah Azza wa Jalla, dies in 2 months. Right after he's instated as the Grand Vizier, the most powerful man of the Khilafat, the Shi'a Khilafat, he dies in 2 months. So now the Imam, or the actual Khalifa, he's like, okay, this is my chance. Let me appoint someone as the Grand Vizier. So he looks around in the army of Shirkuh. He notices a 60-year-old general who has much experience, a 70-year-old military commander who has much experience. Then he sees this young kid, 31 years old, Salahuddin, who doesn't even want to be there. He's like, this is my chance. I'll appoint him as a Grand Vizier and I'll rule over him. His biggest mistake. He makes Salahuddin the Grand Vizier and Salahuddin takes over. Salahuddin did not want to be there. He did not want to be Sultan. He had nothing to do with power. But when Allah puts you in a position of power, when Allah grants you responsibility that you did not seek, now you have to fulfill it. Now, because the help of Allah is there now. The help of Allah is there. Now you can't back out. Allah's put you in that position. Now you can't just run away. So even though he did not want to be there, he wanted to become an alim. He wanted to spend time in Damascus. He wanted to spend time with the ulama. He was supposed to go to Egypt. He didn't want to go. He went to Egypt. He was supposed to spend a couple of months there and then dip back to Damascus. But Allah's qadr took place and he ends up as the Sultan or the Grand Vizier at this point of the Fatimid Khilafat. Eventually the Imam himself, he dies. Right? He probably doesn't even believe in, right? Even Salahuddin feels bad for him. He dies a natural death. He's like 21 or 25. And after that, the Fatimid Khilafat comes to an end. After almost 300 years or 200 years of being a thorn in Sunni Islam, the Fatimid Khilafat comes to an end. And this is the beginning of Salahuddin's Ayyubid dynasty. He takes over Egypt after squashing some rebellions. But as we know, Salahuddin is very, very generous. He has no love of the dunya. He goes in, he sees the palaces of the Shi'i Fatimid dynasty. Unfortunately, the palaces do not exist till today. Whatever happened, they were not maintained. They had 4,000 rooms in their palace. So you can imagine the amount of gold and jewelry and silver and spoils of war that's sitting there. He goes in, he takes everything, gives some to a military commander and spreads it out to the poor in the public. He doesn't take anything for himself. So if you do something like that, the people are going to love you. Even if some of them are Shia, which eventually become Sunni, even if some of them are not happy with your ruling, they eventually start to love you when you see the character and akhlaq of Salahuddin. And he wins over the Egyptian community. And then, surprising enough, 2 years later, Zengi dies. Zengi, Salahuddin's mentor, Nuruddin Zengi dies. So who takes over those lands? Salahuddin. Obviously, it wasn't just like, okay, I'm just going to take it over. There were some rebellions. His own sons, Zengi's sons, wanted to take over. But eventually, Salahuddin incorporates and now is the Sultan of Egypt and the Sultan of Syria as well. So what's left? Jerusalem. So that's the next goal. Since now he's unified, it started with Imaduddin al-Zengi. Then moved on to Nuruddin al-Zengi. This vision, right? This is something we have to keep in mind. Vision doesn't mean that, oh, that's it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to change the world, my name's going to be on the front. No, you start with a vision and the reward will be yours, but it won't necessarily, you won't see the results in your lifetime. If you see the great scholars of the past, the great mujaddidun, the revivers, it wasn't always necessarily them that changed. They had an impact, but it was the students that brought change to the entire world. Whether it's through the institution of Deoband, whether it's through the efforts of Tabligh, whether it's through Tasawwuf, or whether it's through the different institutions that, across the world, it's not necessarily the founders that saw the immense growth. It was the students that took it forward, right? So he had the vision, Zengi, Imaduddin al-Zengi. His son adopted that vision, and then Salahuddin inherited that vision. So the next step was the conquest of Jerusalem itself. Maybe I should mention this at this point. Actually, I'll come back to it. Just remind me to mention about a mimbar. If I forget to mention it, remind me to mention about a mimbar. So, this battle is known as the Battle of Hittin. So what's the background of this battle? Salahuddin, when he comes into power, first thing he does is make treaties with the different communities or the fortresses of the Christian cities that are out there. So he makes a treaty with Reynaud de Chatillon. He's not the king of Jerusalem. He's a ruler of another city or fortress in the area. He makes a treaty with him. He breaks the treaty. And he attacks a Muslim group of individuals who are traveling. And he attacks them, takes them as prisoners. Salahuddin says, listen, give the people back, pay back the money, and we'll let this go. Reynaud de Chatillon says no. And Reynaud de Chatillon was a very evil individual. Okay? Reynaud de Chatillon was a very, very evil, and he has said despicable statements, which I'll come to in a second. Now, Reynaud de Chatillon, he gives tashkil and he convinces the king of Jerusalem to also help him out. The king of Jerusalem, his name was King Guy. But he himself was not a very bad guy. He wasn't a very bad individual. He didn't really want to, but it's kind of dragged into the battle. So he takes his army from Jerusalem, and Reynaud de Chatillon, they go, and there's this big battle known as the Battle of Hittin. Very interesting battle. You can search it up and look it up yourself. I don't want to get into the details of it. But the Christian army was very, very thirsty because Salahuddin dragged them into a field where there was no water, and they're fighting in that, and the Muslims were the only ones who had water. The Christians just gave up and said, just give us water, we don't want to fight anymore, right? So Reynaud de Chatillon and King Guy are both captured. They're brought into the tent of Salahuddin. Salahuddin takes a cold cup of water and gives it to King Guy. King Guy drinks it, and he starts to hand it over to Reynaud de Chatillon. Salahuddin takes the edge of his sword and knocks it out. And he says, I didn't give you permission to give it to him. And Salahuddin says, and then he takes his sword and chops off the head of Reynaud de Chatillon. Now, King Guy is very scared. He's like, I'm next. Salahuddin's like, no, don't worry. It is not befitting of a king to kill another king. But this one went beyond the bounds. This Reynaud de Chatillon, he said, I will go to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's grave, na'udhu billah, and I will take him out of his grave, na'udhu billah. He also says, I will desecrate the Kaaba. When Salahuddin heard this, prior to this battle, he says, by Allah, you will die at my hands. And we know the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when a pious servant of Allah takes an oath upon Allah, Allah fulfills it. And just as you saw, Reynaud de Chatillon's head was cut off by the hand of Salahuddin. And Salahuddin says to King Guy, don't worry, you didn't really do anything like that. You didn't break no treaty. You didn't make such atrocious statements, right? And he lets King Guy go back to Jerusalem. However, King Guy took out the entire standing army of Jerusalem to come to fight. And they were just wiped out. So who's there in Jerusalem? Just a bunch of priests and bunch of priests and Christian imams. There's no one there. So next step, he starts to siege Jerusalem. In the pre-modern world, when you siege a city that doesn't accept a treaty, it doesn't necessarily give up without fighting, right? They didn't want to give up. The priests of the Christian priests, they're like, listen, we know we're going to lose, but it's not befitting of us to just give up Al-Aqsa, so we're going to fight. Salahuddin said, okay, go ahead, do what you want to do. They knew they were going to lose. So in the pre-modern world, when you fought against the enemy and you lost the battle, everyone in that city becomes a prisoner of war, POWs. That's like kind of the ruling or the urf, or kind of like the habit or the custom of the people, right? That everyone in that city now becomes a prisoner of war. So technically, everyone is supposed to become a prisoner of war. But Salahuddin, the priests negotiate, like, listen man, with the people of Al-Aqsa, you can't do this, the Christians. So Salahuddin is like, okay. Originally, actually, Salahuddin wanted to go into Jerusalem like those people came into Jerusalem. He wanted to go in and just wipe them out. But this is why mashwara is very important, consultation. And he takes mashwara with some ulama and some elderly military generals, the elderly people, and they say, no, don't do that. That's not what Islam teaches us. What do the people living here today have to do of 80 years in the past? They didn't do anything. Let's not do that. Salahuddin agrees and he says, listen, not only does he not kill them, not only does he not take them prisoner of war, he says, I will give you 40 days. You pay 10 coins, 10 meager coins in whatever the currency was at that time, and you're free to go with your belongings and you're allowed to leave the city. We won't harm you, we won't take your life, we won't take your wealth, you can leave the city. This is a very, very generous treaty that he's giving them, right? And he says, I'll give you 40 days to do this. At this instance, Christian chroniclers and historians, they say, what happens next is a disgrace for Christianity, and it's an honor for Islam. What happens next is a humiliation to what they did, but it's an honor for the Muslims. All the Christian priests, the Pope, the rich, the merchants, they pay their 10 coins and they leave. They take all their belongings, and all the poor people, all the poor Christians are left in the city. 40 days are over. There's thousands of Christians left in the city. Because after 40 days, all those thousands of people should become prisoners of war. And what happens next is why these Christians said this. There's a disgrace that our Christian priests and Pope and Imams, they left our people to just die or become prisoners of war. And what does Salahuddin do? He walks into the city. The Christian widows, because their husbands just died in the Battle of Hittin, they run to Salahuddin, they're crying. Salahuddin looks at them, he starts crying. And he says, what's going on? He's like, we don't have any wealth to pay up. We can't even go anywhere if we wanted to. Salahuddin says, I will pay you 10 coins. And whatever expenses you need to travel to the next city, he pays from his own side. He pays from his own side. Not only that, Salahuddin, he gifts, his military commanders ask him for a gift of let's say 1,000 POWs. Because now they're all slaves. Give them as a gift to us. Each military commander asked it. His own brother asked that. His brother is the first one to do it. He said, Salahuddin said, okay, here's 1,000 of them. Then he says, I free them all for the sake of Allah. And they're free to go. Each of his military commanders do the same thing. They take 1,000 and they free them for the sake of Allah. By the end of it, every single individual is either freed or Salahuddin Al-Ayubbi paid from his own side. So not a single person, non-military combatant who didn't raise a fuss and attack anybody, not a single one of them was harmed. And he was allowed to leave the city freely. So all the Christians were forced out of the city without any sort of bloodshed. This is why Salahuddin is known as Saladin. This is why Salahuddin, you can read the Christian books. You can read books written by Christians and they depict Salahuddin 95% accurately. Right? There are a couple of things here and there that they misrepresent. But beyond that, they don't really have anything evil to say about Salahuddin. He's the conqueror and liberator of Jerusalem, but he's also the conqueror of hearts. Through his akhlaq, Rasulullah says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ I have only been sent to perfect good qualities. And Salahuddin was able to perfect those qualities. So now, in 1187, which year was Jerusalem conquered? Which year? Anybody? Can anyone save this crowd? Which year was Jerusalem conquered? By 1099, mashallah. Now, about 90 years after, Salahuddin walks into Jerusalem and he retakes Al-Aqsa. He walks into Masjid Al-Aqsa, and one of the first things he does, you see this right over here on the left? This mimbar was built by Nuruddin al-Zangi. He said that when I reconquer Jerusalem, inshallah, I will put this mimbar back. Salahuddin, he goes in. He doesn't build a mimbar in his own name. He takes the mimbar that Nuruddin al-Zangi built and he brings it from Syria and puts it in Masjid al-Aqsa. And this mimbar existed until either 1950s or 1970s. The same mimbar that for about 700, 800 years, the Imam would raise up and give the khutbah from there. A Christian or a Jew, arsonist, burnt it down in 1950s or 1970s. But about 800 years, this same place, 800 years of ulama were making the khutbah from there, the one that Nuruddin Zengi built. Isn't this amazing? The Nuruddin, Salahuddin walks in, he doesn't build anything in his own name. The first thing he does is takes his teachers, his mentors, the vision that his teacher had, and he takes and puts it in. Subhanallah. And these were the people of the past that we have to look to. They weren't looking at their own hasad and like, okay, my masjid, my community only, we have to do only programming only. No, they were looking beyond that. They were looking for Islam. They were not looking for themselves. They were looking for what was best for Islam. So this is Salahuddin. The third crusade happens, and this is the famous battles and conversations that take place between Richard the Lionheart and Salahuddin. We lose some lands, but it was mostly a failure on their part. But what they do agree is that Christians are allowed to come to Al-Aqsa, but they have to give up their swords, and they can come for pilgrimage and visit Masjid Al-Aqsa. And that was the tradition that continued on afterwards, right? When Salahuddin took Jerusalem, they were banned. Right? But at the end of the third crusades, they agreed, Richard and Salahuddin, to allow the Christians to come, but they have to leave the swords outside of the city and weapons outside the city, and they can come in for Hajj and Umrah, pilgrimage of whatever they call it. Right? So now this last slide is very, very important. The effects of the crusades. In the Muslim lands, mostly negligible. It wasn't the end of the world. We don't undermine the pain. People went through difficulty. People went through harm, death, and a lot of other things. But like I mentioned, it's just a strip of the Western Muslim lands, and it was only for a period of 80 years. Especially because what comes right after, in a couple of decades? What happens right after? The Mongols. The Mongols took almost 80% of the Muslim lands. They devastated it. In 1258, they walk into Baghdad with Abu Khan, and they massacre about 1 million to 2 million people in a span of a week. 1 million people in a span of a week. They didn't have bombs and guns. It's swords. Imagine how many people walked in that city to kill 1 million people in a span of a week. Right? So comparing to that, the Crusades it was an afterthought. The Crusades today are very much, I don't want to say advertised obviously, but it was talked about a lot because of the situation of Palestine today, rightfully so. Right? But we have to think of everything, look at everything in its proper picture. That in terms of overall Muslim history, the Crusades in Muslim lands were not the end of the world. It was bad. We don't undermine the pain, but it's not the end of the world. The Mongols were very much more devastating. However, as we know, 3/4 of the Mongols eventually accepted Islam. Right? And that's a story for another day. End of the Fatimids, rise of the Ayub dynasty. But in Europe, on the other hand, it had detrimental and it had huge impacts upon the European ethos. Firstly, it gave a desire for the conquest outside of Europe. Prior to this, they never went outside of Europe. Going to Syria and going to Palestine was the first time they went out of Europe. And they became immensely wealthy off of this, especially Italy. And because of that, it leads directly to the Renaissance. Because of the Crusades, it leads to the Renaissance. The Renaissance obviously leads to the church having a lot more power. And that obviously leads to the scientific revolution, which eventually leads to atheism, which eventually leads to the Industrial Revolution, and that's a long story. But the Crusades have a direct impact upon European history and intellectual history. And this is why right after this, where do they go next? Where do the Europeans go next? Yes, the brother said Spain, Al-Andalus. Because now they want to, ignites the reconquista, or the reconquering of Al-Andalus, or modern day Spain and Portugal. And that's just something to keep in mind, that the Crusades had a huge impact in terms of European history. The final moment, Salahuddin Al-Ayubbi rahimahullah ta'ala, when he passed away, you and I could pay our zakat to Salahuddin. He was zakat eligible. The Sultan of Egypt, the Sultan of Syria, the Fatih of Jerusalem, the conqueror of Jerusalem did not have enough wealth to not be zakat eligible. Rather he was zakat eligible. He only had a few silver coins, no property, no real estate, no garden, no palace. He gave everything out to the people. And this is why he's so beloved. And he was buried with his sword. My dear respected brothers and elders, mothers and sisters, these are the people of the past. But if you want people like them again today, you and I have to change. You and I have to bring these qualities that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us. And it very much starts with education. I'm visiting you here today, myself and Maulana Arif, who are visiting you here today from Chicago, from an institution known as Dar al-Salam Foundation. Our purpose of our visit is very, very, very simple. Get the people, primarily the youth, educated on their deen. Very simple. We want the vast majority of this Muslim Western Ummah to be knowledgeable about their history, about their aqidah, about their fiqh and hadith. 99% of the Muslim Ummah does not know this history. 99%. They know Salahuddin, that's all they know. They don't know who he was. They don't know what went down. They don't know, and this is a brief summary, very brief summary. You can talk about this 5-6 hours about Salahuddin. Very brief summary. But we need to be educated. And our purpose of our visit here is just to highlight some of the programs that we have. We have something going on right now known as a Deen Intensive, which is a 4-week program where we have 5 to 6 classes. I'm going to briefly explain these classes. Very important. Even if we're older, we should know what these classes are about so we can convey to our children, nieces, nephews. The first class is Aqidah. What is Aqidah? Our belief system. We have a belief system. In this class, we are going to discuss how to rationally prove God's existence. How to prove the legitimacy of the Quran. The truthfulness of Rasulullah ﷺ statements. We're going to deconstruct atheism. Talk about science in Islam, evolution in Islam. These are very, very, very important questions that youth are facing today. If we don't address them, if we don't educate them, the non-Muslims are going to educate them. The non-Muslims are going to brainwash them. The second class is known as Western Intellectual History, where we talk about, we live in a postmodern era. We live in a world filled with modernity. We live in a world that's feministic, that is capitalistic, materialistic, liberalism, LGBTQ, and a bunch of other letters that come after. Right? This is the type of world we live in. How did it get here today? It starts with a 2,000-year history. It continues from the Crusades. It starts way before the Crusades, starts from the Crusades and continues from there. It's a whole linear picture of how we got here today. If we don't study these isms, if we don't educate our youth about these isms and how they came to be and the falsehood of their ideologies, we are going to lose our youth. We're going to lose our young community. We're going to lose our Muslim Ummah in the West. We need to be grounded. We need to know these isms. We need to fight against these isms. We need to establish our aqaid, our beliefs, and defend our creed from these infiltrating ideologies which the vast Muslim majority of youth, if you ask them today, they adopt some sort of ism today without even knowing, and some voluntary advocate for it. The other classes are hadith, fiqh, and spirituality and tazkiyah. So that's our 4-week program. 1 week has finished. Some students from here I know are joining from tomorrow, inshallah. You can continue to join as well. Also, we have a 1-year program which begins August 16th, where you learn all these classes I mentioned, as well as the Arabic language. By the end of the first year, you're able to speak fluently in the Arabic language. You're able to read the classical text of Arabic, and there are a couple other classes added as well. These programs are both offered for brothers and sisters. Brothers there's dorming available. If your sisters, obviously you have to come with a mahram, and your dorming and stuff is taken care on your own. But the brothers can come and they can dorm in these the houses that we have around the campus. Any program we offer the brothers is offered for the sisters. As well, we have a bunch of online programs. Unfortunately, we are out of flyers. This is the last masjid in our 3-day visit. But you can go to masjidds.org, and it has a list of online programs where you can learn online Arabic. Some of these classes I mentioned are also taught for adults. 3 classes in the morning if your morning works out for you. 3 classes in the evening if the evening works out for you. And these are different programs we have. Lastly, I request every single one of you, we have a sign-up sheet. This sign-up sheet will inform you of different programs that will take place in our institution, and possibly of different programs when we visit different localities as well. Please just write your name and your email address, inshallah. Maulana Arif will start passing it around. There's a pen inside the book bag. And please just write your email so you can be updated with different programs. We host a lot of online programs as well. Again, we need to be educated. Without education, Salahuddin was educated first before he became a sultan. There was no way he was going to become Sultan Salahuddin if he wasn't educated in our deen. You have to be educated. You can't be a leader of any sort of Muslim community without being educated. It's impossible. We have our paradigm and our principles and our usul. If you don't know those usul and principles, you can't lead the Muslims as a Muslim community. You can lead them as something else. But to claim to lead them as a Muslim community, you can't do that without learning your deen. So we need our youth to be educated, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair for this opportunity. I thank the Masjid Hamza community, the board members, the Imam, and whoever else is in charge of facilitating this and setting this up. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to accept them from us. Ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to grant us leaders like Salahuddin. Ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to grant us the tawfiq to continue to learn and be educated in our deen. Jazakallah khair wa akhu da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. If there's any questions about our programs, inshallah both of us in the back, you can talk to us inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.